Behind her floral curtains on Maple Grove Lane, Patricia Wilson grips her phone with trembling fingers, reporting suspicious activity across the street. But in the soil of this quiet suburban refuge lies a secret that will shatter her carefully maintained world. Sometimes the greatest discoveries bloom in the gardens we fear to tend, and the most profound changes begin with a single, misplaced call. Patricia Wilson peered through her floral curtains for the third time that hour, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the windowsill. The moving truck had arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, disrupting her usually quiet Saturday morning on Maple Grove Lane, where she'd lived for the past 27 years. The family moving in across the street didn't fit her image of the neighborhood. A man and woman, probably in their late 30s, and 2 children, a teenage girl and a younger boy. They were black, and something about their presence made Patricia's shoulders tense. She'd watched the property values in her precious cul-de-sac with hawk-like attention since her husband's passing 3 years ago, and change of any kind made her nervous. "They're probably renters," she muttered to herself, though the moving truck clearly contained the kind of furniture that suggested otherwise. Antiques, carefully wrapped paintings, boxes labeled Dad's Medical Books. The teenage girl caught Patricia staring and offered a friendly wave. Patricia let the curtain fall back into place. By afternoon, the moving truck had departed, leaving the new family to unpack. Patricia noticed the man, tall, distinguished-looking in wire-rimmed glasses, carefully arranging what appeared to be medical texts in the home office visible through the front window. The woman, wearing a Yale sweatshirt, directed the placement of furniture with the confidence of someone used to running a household. But it was the constant coming and going that set Patricia's nerves on edge. People she didn't recognize kept arriving, mostly black, some carrying dishes, others with boxes or bags. In her day, neighbors had welcomed newcomers with pies and casseroles, not this steady stream of strangers. "Probably their whole extended family moving in," she said to Mr. Whiskers, her Persian cat. "There goes the neighborhood." As dusk approached, Patricia noticed the teenage boy from next door, Tommy Chen, helping the new family's son set up what looked like a basketball hoop in the driveway. More cars arrived, parking along the street. Music drifted across the way, nothing too loud, but distinctly unfamiliar to Patricia's ears. She reached for her phone. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity," she spoke carefully into the receiver. "There's been unusual traffic all day at 1487 Maple Grove. Large groups of people coming and going. I'm concerned about safety in the neighborhood." The dispatcher's voice was professional, detached. "Can you describe the nature of your concern, ma'am?" "Well," Patricia lowered her voice, though she was alone in the house. "They don't seem to belong here, if you understand my meaning." "Are you observing any illegal activity?" "Not exactly, but—" Patricia watched another car pull up, this one carrying what appeared to be a covered dish. "There's just so many of them, and we've never had this kind of situation in our neighborhood before." 10 minutes later, a patrol car rolled quietly onto Maple Grove Lane. Patricia felt a surge of satisfaction, which quickly turned to confusion as she watched the scene unfold. Officer Sarah Chen, Tommy's mother, Patricia realized with a start, stepped out of the vehicle. Instead of approaching with suspicion, she broke into a wide smile as the new family's father came down the driveway to greet her. "Dr. Richardson!" Officer Chen's delighted voice carried across the quiet street. "I didn't know you were moving to our neighborhood." Patricia strained to hear more of the conversation, but could only make out fragments. Something about the hospital, about lives saved, about what a small world it was. The new family's mother had joined them now, carrying what looked like a plate of food. Officer Chen accepted it with obvious pleasure, then reached for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Chen. The report at 1487 Maple Grove is unfounded. The new residents are Dr. James Richardson and his family. He's the head of pediatric surgery at Metropolitan." There was a pause, then, "Yes, the same Dr. Richardson who saved my Tommy last year." Patricia felt her face grow hot as she watched Officer Chen join the gathering in the driveway. More neighbors were emerging now, drawn by the patrol car but staying for what was clearly becoming an impromptu welcome party. The Richardsons' daughter was showing something on her phone to Tommy Chen and the Miller girls from 2 doors down. The younger boy was already dribbling his basketball with neighborhood kids who seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. But It was the expression on Officer Chen's face as she talked with Dr. Richardson that made Patricia's stomach twist. The same doctor who had saved her son. And here was Patricia, having called the police on him for simply moving into his new home. The story was far from over, though. As night fell on Maple Grove Lane, Patricia Wilson stood alone behind her curtains, watching a scene that would force her to confront truths about herself, her neighborhood, and the changing world outside her carefully maintained walls. The gathering across the street continued to grow, a tapestry of faces and voices that challenged everything Patricia thought she knew about her perfect little cul-de-sac. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that perhaps the real disruption to her quiet life wasn't the new family at all, but rather the walls she had built around her own heart. The next morning, Patricia woke to the sound of laughter. Peering through her bathroom window, she saw the Richardson children shooting hoops in their driveway with several other neighborhood kids. The teenage girl, she'd learned her name was Maya, was teaching Tommy Chen's younger sister a new dribbling technique. The scene bothered Patricia in ways she couldn't quite articulate. When she'd moved to Maple Grove Lane with her late husband Howard in the 90s, the neighborhood had been different, quieter, more orderly. Now there were children playing basketball at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. She was about to close her curtains when she noticed Mrs. Richardson, Dr. Richardson's wife, walking across the street toward her house. Patricia's heart raced as the doorbell rang. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the door. "Good morning." Mrs. Richardson's smile was warm, professional. "I'm Grace Richardson. We moved in yesterday and I wanted to properly introduce myself to all our neighbors." She held out a Tupperware container. "I brought some banana bread, my grandmother's recipe." Patricia found herself accepting the container automatically. Thank you. I'm Patricia Wilson." "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Wilson. We've heard wonderful things about this neighborhood." Grace's eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "Officer Chen was telling us about the community garden project you started." Patricia blinked, surprised that anyone remembered the garden. It had been Howard's idea originally, transforming the empty lot at the end of the street into a community space. After his death, she'd let it fall into disrepair. "That was years ago," she said stiffly. "Well, I have a bit of a green thumb myself," Grace continued, seemingly undeterred by Patricia's coolness. "I was hoping to get involved if the project is still active. Maya, my daughter, is actually doing her science fair project on urban agriculture." Before Patricia could respond, a commotion erupted from the Richardsons' driveway. The basketball had gone into the street, and Patricia watched as the Richardsons' young son, she hadn't caught his name yet, darted after it. "Marcus!" Grace called sharply. "What's our rule about the street?" The boy froze, then backed onto the sidewalk. "Sorry, Mom, but Tommy says there's hardly ever any traffic in the cul-de-sac." "Hardly ever isn't never," Grace replied firmly. "Safety first, remember?" Patricia found herself nodding unconsciously. It was exactly what she would have said, had said, countless times, to her own children before they'd grown up and moved away. "Your son," Patricia heard herself saying. "He's named Marcus?" Grace's expression softened. "Yes, after my grandfather. He was one of the first black doctors in our hometown." Patricia's hand tightened on the Tupperware container. "My husband, Howard, he was a doctor too. Family practice before he passed." Something shifted in the air between the two women. Grace's eyes took in the empty chairs on Patricia's porch, the slightly overgrown garden beds that Howard had once kept so neat. "Mrs. Wilson," Grace said gently, "we're having a small dinner tonight. Nothing fancy, just getting to know our neighbors. Would you like to join us?" Patricia opened her mouth to refuse, but before she could, another voice joined the conversation. "Mom! Mom! Come quick!" Maya called from across the street. "We found something in the basement." Grace turned, concern flickering across her face. "Everything okay?" "You have to see this." Maya's voice was excited rather than alarmed. "It's like a time capsule or something." Grace glanced back at Patricia. "Would you like to come see? You've lived here longer than anyone. Maybe you know something about it." Patricia hesitated. She hadn't set foot in that house since the Hendersons had moved out last spring, but curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite name, made her nod. As they crossed the street together, Patricia couldn't help but notice how the morning sun caught the silver in Grace's hair, how her Yale sweatshirt had been replaced by a crisp blouse and slacks, how she moved with the same confidence Patricia remembered in herself, back when she'd been the neighborhood's unofficial welcome wagon. The story was about to take an unexpected turn in that basement, one that would challenge not just Patricia's prejudices, but her understanding of her own history on Maple Grove Lane. But for now, she followed Grace Richardson into the house that had stood across from hers for 27 years, carrying banana bread and decades of assumptions that were about to be shaken to their core. The Richardsons' basement was cool and musty, with the lingering scent of old paper and forgotten things. Maya stood near an opened wall panel, excitement radiating from her face as she held up what looked like an old leather-bound book. "Look what we found while Dad was checking the wiring." She handed the book to her mother. "There's a whole bunch of stuff hidden in here." Dr. James Richardson emerged from behind a stack of moving boxes, wire-rimmed glasses slightly askew. "Mrs. Wilson, good morning. I apologize for the chaos, but it seems your old neighbors left us quite a mystery." Patricia moved closer, drawn by curiosity despite herself. The wall panel had been removed to reveal a small cavity, and within it lay several items, more books, what appeared to be letters, and a small wooden box. Grace carefully opened the leather book. "These are diary entries," she said softly. "From 1963. Patricia felt a sudden chill. "The Hendersons didn't build this house," she said. "It was the Martins before them, and before that—" She paused, memories stirring. "The Johnsons lived here. They were the first family on the street, back when all this was just farmland being developed." "The Johnsons?" Maya asked, picking up another book. "Eleanor and William Johnson," Patricia nodded. "They were—" She stopped, something clicking into place. "They were involved in the civil rights movement. Eleanor used to tell stories about it before she passed. Howard and I bought our house from them in '96. Dr. Richardson was examining the wooden box. "Look at this," he said quietly, opening it to reveal a collection of photographs, letters, and what appeared to be train tickets. "These are dated 1964, and look at the addresses. They form a route from Georgia to Michigan." Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. "The Underground Railroad," she whispered. "Not the original one, but Eleanor once mentioned they helped families heading north during the civil rights era, called it the New Underground Railroad. I never knew if the stories were true." Young Marcus, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Like in my history book? They helped people escape?" "Yes," Grace answered, her voice thick with emotion, as she read from one of the letters. "Listen to this. My dearest friend, the family arrived safely. The children are well, though tired. Your basement room saved their lives last night when the searchers came. God bless you for your courage." Dr. Richardson looked at Patricia. "Did you know, all these years, did you know this was here?" Patricia shook her head, shame and wonder fighting for dominance in her chest. "No, Eleanor tried to tell me stories, before she died, about the importance of helping others, about fighting injustice. But I was younger then, busy with my own life. I didn't really listen." Maya was carefully laying out the photographs. "Look at this one," she said, holding up a faded image of a group of people standing in front of the house. The date on the back says, "Freedom Summer, 1964. Patricia leaned closer, and her breath caught. In the photo, Eleanor Johnson stood proud and tall on the front porch, her arm around a young black woman holding a baby. And there, in the background, was the garden. The same garden Patricia had later helped Howard create. The same garden now lying neglected at the end of the street. It was a signal, she realized aloud. Eleanor's garden. The flowers weren't just for show. They were signals to people seeking shelter. Red flowers meant danger. White meant safe passage. She looked up at Grace. "That's why she was so insistent that we maintain certain plants when we took over the garden project." The basement seemed to hold its breath as the weight of history settled around them. Here they stood, decades later, a black family who'd achieved the dreams those freedom riders had fought for, and a white woman who'd called the police on them for simply existing in this space. Dr. Richardson carefully replaced the wooden box in the wall cavity. "This isn't just history," he said quietly. "This is a responsibility." "Dad?" Marcus looked up from one of the letters he'd been studying. Can we restore the garden? Make it like it was?" Grace met Patricia's eyes. "That depends," she said softly. "Mrs. Wilson, would you be willing to help us? To teach us what Eleanor taught you about the plants? Patricia looked around the basement, at the faces watching her. Dr. Richardson with his gentle dignity, Grace with her knowing smile, Maya with her eager curiosity, and young Marcus holding history in his hands. She thought about the call she'd made yesterday, about the assumptions she'd carried for so long, about Eleanor Johnson's patient attempts to teach her about courage and community. The story was shifting now, moving towards something deeper than simple prejudice and redemption. In that basement, surrounded by evidence of past courage and present possibility, Patricia Wilson faced a choice about what kind of neighbor, what kind of person she wanted to be. But the revelations weren't over. There was more to discover in those hidden papers, more truth to confront, and more bridges to build on Maple Grove Lane. The following weekend found Patricia kneeling in the community garden alongside Maya Richardson, her arthritic knees protesting as they cleared years of overgrowth. The teenager was carefully documenting each plant they uncovered, cross-referencing them with Eleanor Johnson's garden diagrams found among the basement papers. "So the white roses went here," Maya said, consulting her tablet where she'd scanned the old documents. "And the red tulips along the fence line?" "That's right," Patricia nodded, surprised by how much she remembered. Eleanor was very specific about the placement. She said it was about sight lines, being able to see the signals from different approaches to the neighborhood. Dr. Richardson and Marcus were working on repairing the old wooden benches, while Grace organized a growing group of neighbors who'd come to help. The Chen family was there in full force. Officer Sarah Chen had brought coffee and donuts for everyone, and Tommy was helping his father rebuild the garden's stone border. "Mrs. Wilson," Maya's voice was hesitant, "can I ask you something?" Patricia sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Of course. Why did you call the police on us that first day?" The question hung in the air like summer humidity. Patricia felt her face flush, but Maya's expression held no accusation, only genuine curiosity. Patricia looked down at her dirt-covered hands. "I was afraid, I suppose. Not of you exactly, but of change. Of losing something I thought I needed to protect." "Like what?" Before Patricia could answer, Marcus came running over, excitement on his face. "Mom! Dad! Look what we found under the old bench." Everyone gathered around as Dr. Richardson carefully lifted a rusted metal box from beneath the rotting wood. The lid was sealed with age, but the doctor's steady surgeon's hands worked it free. Inside, they found more letters, these dated 1965, and a collection of small items: a child's marble, a worn baseball, a hair ribbon. "They're mementos," Grace said softly, reading one of the letters. "From the children who passed through here. Eleanor had them leave something behind, something to remember them by." Patricia remembered something suddenly. Howard, my husband, he used to say Eleanor told him the garden wasn't just about helping people escape. It was about helping them remember they were human, that even in fear and flight, they could stop to smell flowers, children could play with marbles, girls could wear pretty ribbons in their hair. Officer Chen picked up the baseball, turning it over in her hands. "You know, when we got the call that night, about suspicious activity at your house, I almost couldn't believe it was you making the report, Mrs. Wilson. I remembered how you brought us casseroles when Tommy was in the hospital, how you sat with me during his surgery." "The surgery Dr. Richardson performed," Patricia said quietly. "Life has a way of connecting us," Dr. Richardson observed, "whether we're ready for those connections or not." Maya had been quiet, studying the letters. "Listen to this," she said. "Dear Mrs. Johnson, we made it to Detroit. Johnny still plays with the marble you gave him. He says it helps him remember the flowers in your garden, how for one night we felt safe and human again. Sometimes I think that memory gave us the strength to keep going." Patricia felt tears prick her eyes. She looked around the garden, at the neighbors working together, at the children playing nearby, at the Richardson family who had unknowingly chosen a house with such profound history. But there was more to come. As Marcus dug deeper beneath the bench, he found something else, a sealed envelope addressed to the future owners of 1487 Maple Grove Lane. The postmark was just months before Eleanor Johnson's death. The group fell silent as Dr. Richardson carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the pages within. What they revealed would change not just their understanding of the house's history, but the future of Maple Grove Lane itself. Eleanor Johnson had left one final lesson about courage, community, and the ongoing work of justice. And as Patricia stood in the garden she had once abandoned, surrounded by the very changes she had feared, she realized that sometimes the greatest acts of courage involve opening not just our doors, but our hearts. The story continued to unfold in that garden, where the past and present merged in unexpected ways, and where the seeds of transformation were once again taking root in fertile soil. Dr. Richardson's hands trembled slightly as he read Eleanor Johnson's letter aloud. To those who find this garden, if you're reading this, you've discovered more than just old letters and forgotten mementos. You've found a testament to what this neighborhood once was, and what it can be again. This house, this garden, they were never meant to be just a safe house or a waypoint. They were meant to be proof that community is stronger than fear, that neighbors can become family, that courage often wears the simplest disguises. A pot of coffee offered to weary travelers, a child's marble given in friendship, flowers planted to guide the way home. But my work isn't finished. The world has changed since those nights when we harbored families fleeing north. But the need for sanctuary remains. That's why I'm leaving this letter, along with a trust fund meant to transform this garden into something more, a community center where all children can learn, play, and grow together. The money has been waiting in trust at Millbrook National Bank, gathering interest for the day someone would find this letter and continue the work we started. Patricia gasped audibly. The empty lot next to the garden, the one the city had been trying to develop for years, Eleanor had owned that too. Dr. Richardson continued reading. To claim the trust, you'll need 3 things: this letter, the wooden box from the basement, and most importantly, the courage to build something new. The garden was never just about flowers. It was about growing hope in unlikely places. Choose wisely what you plant here, with faith in the future, Eleanor Johnson. The gathered neighbors stood in stunned silence. Officer Chen was the first to speak. A community center. This neighborhood could really use that. The closest youth programs are all downtown. Grace Richardson looked thoughtful. I've been wondering where to base my literacy program. I've been driving into the city 3 times a week to volunteer. And my medical outreach clinics, Dr. Richardson added. We've been looking for a permanent location. Patricia found her voice. Eleanor knew, she said softly. She knew the neighborhood would change, that it would need this. She gestured to the garden, to the diverse group of neighbors gathered there. She was preparing for today, all those years ago. Maya, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Look at this. She was examining the back of Eleanor's letter. There's a blueprint. The garden design, it's not just about signals anymore. If you look at it from above, the flower beds form a pattern. Each section represents a different part of the community center she envisioned. Marcus pointed excitedly. This part here could be the basketball court. And look, this circular area, it's perfect for a reading garden. The neighbors began clustering around the blueprint, adding their own ideas. Tommy Chen's father, an architect, was already sketching modifications on his tablet. Officer Chen was on the phone with the police community relations department, discussing youth program partnerships. But Patricia stood apart, overwhelmed by memories and possibilities. She remembered Eleanor Johnson's patient smile when young Patricia had complained about the strict requirements for maintaining certain flowers, never understanding their true significance. She thought about how she'd let the garden decay after Howard's death, retreating behind her curtains as the neighborhood changed around her. Grace Richardson noticed her standing alone and came over. Mrs. Wilson, are you all right? Patricia wiped at her eyes. I was so wrong about everything. About you, about this neighborhood, about what it means to be a community. You know what I think? Grace said gently. I think Eleanor Johnson left more than just a trust fund. She left us a choice, all of us, about what kind of neighbors we want to be, what kind of legacy we want to create. Dr. Richardson joined them, holding Eleanor's letter carefully. The bank opens tomorrow morning. Mrs. Wilson, would you be willing to come with us? As the longest-standing resident, your testimony about Eleanor and the garden's history would help verify the letter's authenticity. Patricia looked around at the garden coming back to life, at the neighbors working together, at the future taking shape in Tommy Chen's father's drawings. She thought about the call she'd made just a week ago and how different things might have been if she'd let fear win. But the story wasn't finished. Eleanor Johnson had planted more than just flowers in this soil. She had planted possibilities that were only now beginning to bloom. And as the summer sun began to set on Maple Grove Lane, casting long shadows across the garden where so much history had unfolded, Patricia Wilson realized that sometimes the greatest journeys don't require leaving home at all. They just require opening the door and stepping outside. Monday morning found Patricia sitting in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Millbrook National Bank, alongside the Richardsons, and a rather bewildered bank manager named Mr. Peters. The wooden box from the basement sat on the table between them, along with Eleanor's letter and a thick folder of legal documents. "This is unprecedented," Mr. Peters said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the trust documentation. "Mrs. Johnson established this account in 1996 with explicit instructions that it could only be accessed under these exact circumstances." "And the amount?" Dr. Richardson asked quietly. Mr. Peters cleared his throat. "With compound interest over 27 years, just over $2 million. Patricia felt her hands shake. Eleanor had been sitting on this fortune all those years, living modestly, never letting on. "There's more," Mr. Peters continued, pulling out another document. "Mrs. Johnson apparently purchased that vacant lot outright before her death. The deed is held in trust as well. She also—" He paused, seeming almost embarrassed. "She left a video." Grace leaned forward. "A video?" The bank manager nodded, reaching for a remote control. A screen descended from the ceiling, and suddenly Eleanor Johnson's face filled it, younger than Patricia remembered her last, but with the same knowing smile. "If you're watching this," Eleanor's recorded voice filled the room, "then you've found my letters, and hopefully you've already started working in the garden. That's good. Gardens have a way of bringing people together, of making them forget their differences while they dig in the same soil." Patricia felt tears threatening again as Eleanor continued. "But the real work is just beginning. This money isn't just for building walls and programs. It's for building bridges. Every child who finds shelter in this center, every family who finds community here, every neighbor who discovers friendship where they once saw strangers, that's the real investment." The camera moved closer to Eleanor's face. "And Patricia, dear, if you're there, and I suspect you are, remember what Howard used to say about healing. How sometimes the medicine isn't in the pills, but in the caring. You've carried your grief like a shield, child. It's time to let it become a bridge instead." Patricia gasped. How had Eleanor known, all those years ago, what she would become after Howard's death? How had she seen so clearly the way Patricia would retreat behind her curtains, shutting out the changing world? Eleanor's voice continued. "To whoever owns our house now, you're not just homeowners. You're caretakers of a legacy. This neighborhood was built on the belief that love is stronger than fear, that community is more powerful than division, that every garden needs different flowers to truly bloom." Dr. Richardson reached for Grace's hand as they watched. Maya wiped tears from her eyes. Even Mr. Peters seemed moved. "The plans for the center are in the trust documents, but they're just suggestions. Times change, needs change. What matters is the spirit behind them. Create something that brings people together. Build something that helps them see each other as neighbors, not strangers. Plant seeds of understanding and tend them as carefully as you would tend a garden." The video ended with Eleanor looking directly into the camera, her eyes somehow seeming to see right into their present moment. Remember, the most beautiful gardens grow in unexpected places, and the strongest communities are built by people brave enough to open their doors to change. Mr. Peters quietly began organizing paperwork as the screen went dark. "We'll need signatures from all parties to transfer the trust. Mrs. Wilson, as the witness to Mrs. Johnson's residency and the garden's history, you'll need to sign as well." But Patricia was lost in thought, remembering something else Eleanor had once told her. "Neighbors are just family you haven't recognized yet." Grace touched her arm gently. "Mrs. Wilson, are you ready?" Patricia looked at the Richardsons, the family she'd feared would ruin her neighborhood, who instead were helping to fulfill its destiny. She looked at the trust documents that would transform an abandoned garden into a center of community and hope. She looked at her own hands, still dirty from working in Eleanor's garden over the weekend. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." But as they began signing papers, none of them could have predicted how the next few months would test their resolve, challenge their assumptions, and ultimately proved that Eleanor Johnson's vision for Maple Grove Lane was even more necessary than they had imagined. The story was still unfolding, like a flower slowly opening its petals to the sun. And in its heart lay more surprises, more challenges, and more opportunities for growth than any of them could have anticipated. 3 months later, Patricia stood at her window, but this time she wasn't hiding behind curtains. She watched openly as construction crews worked on the foundation of what would become the Johnson Community Center. The garden had been temporarily relocated to raised beds along the perimeter, its flowers still standing sentinel as they had for decades. The past months had brought both progress and pushback. Not everyone on Maple Grove Lane shared Eleanor Johnson's vision of a changing community. The Petersons at number 1492 had started a petition against the center, citing concerns about traffic and noise. The Hendersons, who had moved away, sent a strongly worded letter through their lawyer, claiming the discovery of historical artifacts in their former house entitled them to a portion of the trust. But for every voice of opposition, 3 more rose in support. Today was proving to be particularly challenging. Patricia watched as Mrs. Peterson marched up to the construction site, waving papers and demanding to speak to someone in charge. Dr. Richardson emerged from the partially finished building, still wearing his surgical scrubs. He'd come straight from an emergency operation to oversee the delivery of building materials. Patricia didn't hesitate. She grabbed her garden hat and headed across the street. "Barbara Peterson," she called out as she approached. "I believe you were looking for someone in charge. Well, I served on the neighborhood council with Eleanor Johnson for 15 years. Would you like to hear what she had to say about people who mistake privilege for property values?" Mrs. Peterson turned, startled by Patricia's direct approach. "Patricia? But I thought you of all people would understand. This center will change everything about our neighborhood." "That's exactly the point." Grace Richardson's voice joined the conversation. She was carrying a tray of lemonade for the construction workers. "Change isn't something to fear, it's something to guide." Young Marcus ran up, excitement on his face. "Dad, Mrs. Wilson, they found another box during the excavation." The construction foreman carefully handed over a mud-covered metal container similar to the one they'd found in the garden. Dr. Richardson cleaned it with his surgical precision, then opened it before the growing crowd. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings from the 1960s, documenting the neighborhood's early development. But it was the handwritten note on top that caught everyone's attention. "To the future?" Dr. Richardson read aloud. "When we broke ground on Maple Grove Lane, many said a planned community like this would never work. They said people weren't ready to live side by side with those who looked different, thought different, prayed different. We built it anyway. Every brick laid was a bet on humanity's better nature. Every house was a promise that community is stronger than fear. If you're reading this, you're not just finding history, you're making it." Signed, William Johnson. Mrs. Peterson's hands trembled as she looked at the yellowed clippings. One showed her own house being built, and there in the background was William Johnson, Eleanor's husband, laying the cornerstone for what would become Maple Grove Lane. I had no idea," she whispered. "None of us did," Patricia said gently. "We forgot what this neighborhood was built for. But now we have a chance to remember, and to build something new." Maya, who had been documenting everything for her school project, spoke up. "Mrs. Peterson, would you like to see the original blueprints? The community center actually incorporates designs from all the original houses on the street. See this archway? It's modeled after your front entrance." Slowly, the tension began to dissipate. Mrs. Peterson found herself drawn into a discussion about the center's architectural features. Other neighbors, attracted by the commotion, joined the conversation. Tommy Chen's father pulled out his drawings, showing how the new structure would honor the neighborhood's history while serving its future. But there was more still to come. As the group discussed the plans, Officer Chen pulled up in her patrol car, her face serious. She had news that would test their newfound unity and force them all to confront the true meaning of community. The story was building towards something none of them could have predicted, a challenge that would prove whether Eleanor Johnson's faith in human nature was justified, and whether the residents of Maple Grove Lane could truly become the community she had envisioned. Officer Chen gathered everyone in the Richardsons' living room, her usually composed face showing signs of strain. "The city council is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow. There's been a proposal to rezone this entire area for commercial development." The room erupted in confused protests, but Officer Chen raised her hand for silence. Apparently, some major retailers have been eyeing this location for a shopping complex. They're arguing that the neighborhood's historical designation expired when the last original homeowner, Eleanor Johnson, passed away. But what about the trust, the community center? Grace asked. That's just it, Officer Chen sighed. The developers are claiming the trust isn't valid because it wasn't properly registered with the City Planning Commission in 1996. They are prepared to offer buyouts to all current residents. Patricia felt her world tilting. She watched the faces around her, Dr. Richardson's quiet determination, Grace's concerned frown, Maya's growing anger, Mrs. Peterson's shock. Even Marcus seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, clutching one of the marbles they'd found in the garden. "They can't do this," Maya burst out. "This isn't just property. It's history. It's important." Mrs. Peterson stood up, surprising everyone. "She's right. I may have been wrong about the community center, but I'm not wrong about this. This neighborhood means something." Dr. Richardson had been quietly reviewing the paperwork Officer Chen brought. "Look at this," he said suddenly. "The development company, Sterling Properties, owned by a Thomas Henderson." "Henderson?" Patricia's eyes widened. "As in—" "The previous owners of our house," Grace finished. "The ones who claimed they deserved part of Eleanor's trust." "It gets worse," Officer Chen added. "They've already secured preliminary approval from 3 council members. The only way to stop this is to prove the historical significance of the neighborhood and show that the trust was part of a larger, documented civil rights preservation effort." Patricia felt something stirring in her memory. "The basement," she said suddenly. "Eleanor never did anything without documentation. There has to be more." They descended to the Richardsons' basement, where the wall panels still gaped open from their earlier discoveries. Dr. Richardson began carefully removing more of the surrounding wallboard, revealing a larger cavity than they'd initially found. "Here," he said, pulling out a dust-covered briefcase. It was hidden behind the other materials. The briefcase contained exactly what they needed, and more. Eleanor Johnson had indeed registered the trust with the city, but she'd done it through a historical preservation society that had since been absorbed by the state archives. There were photos documenting the neighborhood's role in civil rights history, official correspondence with state historical societies, and most damning of all, letters from the Henderson family themselves, dating back to 1975, acknowledging the historical importance of the house and garden. "Thomas Henderson is trying to erase his own family's recognition of this history," Grace said, disgusted. "For what? A shopping mall?" But it was the final document in the briefcase that changed everything. A deed restriction, filed by William and Eleanor Johnson when they first developed Maple Grove Lane, requiring that any major changes to the neighborhood's residential status would need unanimous approval from all property owners. "This is still binding," Officer Chen confirmed after making some calls. "They can't rezone without everyone agreeing." Mrs. Peterson straightened her spine. "Well, they certainly don't have my approval. Not anymore." One by one, the neighbors voiced their opposition. But they all knew the fight wasn't over. The city council meeting was tomorrow, and they would need more than just documents and deeds. They would need to prove that Maple Grove Lane wasn't just a collection of houses. It was a living testimony to what community could be. As they planned their strategy late into the night, Patricia found herself looking at the faces around her, black, white, Asian, young, old, all united in purpose. Eleanor Johnson's vision wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about protecting the possibility of a future where differences strengthened rather than divided a community. The story was building toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of a neighborhood, but the legacy of all those who had worked, hoped, and sacrificed to create something special on this quiet lane. Tomorrow would test their unity, their courage, and their faith in the power of community to overcome greed and fear. And as the neighbors dispersed to prepare for the battle ahead, Patricia realized that Eleanor had left them one final gift: the understanding that sometimes the greatest act of preservation is not keeping things the same, but ensuring they can grow and change while keeping their heart intact. The city council chambers were packed the next morning. Thomas Henderson stood at the podium, sleek in his expensive suit, presenting glossy renderings of a proposed shopping complex that would erase decades of history. But when it was their turn to speak, The residents of Maple Grove Lane had something more powerful than architectural drawings. They had truth. One by one, they approached the podium. Officer Chen presented police records showing how the neighborhood's unique design had created one of the lowest crime rates in the city. Tommy's father, the architect, demonstrated how the proposed community center would actually increase property values while preserving historical significance. Maya and Marcus had spent the night creating a digital presentation of all their findings, including interviews with elderly residents from neighboring areas who remembered seeking shelter in Eleanor Johnson's garden. The council chambers fell silent as they played video testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by the quiet courage of one neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson, to everyone's surprise, gave an impassioned speech about learning to see beyond her own prejudices, about understanding that preservation meant more than just maintaining property values. But it was Patricia who delivered the final blow. 27 years ago, she began, her voice steady, I stood in my window and watched the world change around me. I closed my curtains because I was afraid of difference, of change, of loss. Last week, I stood at that same window and watched children of all colors playing in Eleanor Johnson's garden, planning their contributions to a community center that will serve everyone. She lifted Eleanor's letter. This trust isn't just about money or buildings. It's about faith. Faith in the possibility that people can grow, that communities can heal, that the walls we build between each other can become bridges. Turning to face Thomas Henderson, she continued, You want to talk about property values? What's the value of a child finding acceptance, of a family finding community, of a neighborhood that stands as living proof that America's promises of equality and opportunity aren't just words? She placed the deed restriction on the council's desk. Eleanor and William Johnson didn't just build houses. They built hope, and they made sure that hope was protected by law. The council voted unanimously to deny the rezoning request and grant immediate historical protection status to Maple Grove Lane. Thomas Henderson left in defeat, his dreams of profit crushed by the weight of history and community. 1 year later, Patricia stood in the garden of the completed Johnson Community Center. The flowers still bloomed in their strategic patterns, but now they surrounded a vibrant hub of community life. Children played basketball on courts named after William Johnson. Grace Richardson's literacy program had a waiting list. Dr. Richardson's medical outreach clinic served families from across the city. The garden itself had expanded, with sections maintained by different neighbors. Mrs. Peterson's roses grew alongside the Chen's traditional Chinese medicinal herbs. Maya's science project on urban agriculture had won state recognition and spawned a neighborhood farming initiative. Marcus, now a dedicated young historian, led tours of the property, proudly showing visitors the preserved basement room with its hidden compartment, now a small museum documenting the neighborhood's role in civil rights history. As Patricia watched a new family being welcomed to the street, this time with no curtains twitching in judgment, she felt Eleanor Johnson's presence in the gentle breeze that stirred the flowers. "You were right, Eleanor," she whispered. "The most beautiful gardens do grow in unexpected places." She touched the community center's cornerstone, where they'd embedded the marble found in the garden, the one left behind by a child fleeing north so many years ago. Beside it, they'd placed a plaque with Eleanor's words, "Every garden needs different flowers to truly bloom." The story of Maple Grove Lane wasn't just about overcoming prejudice or preserving history. It was about the continuous work of growing community, of nurturing understanding, of believing that even the smallest acts of opening our doors and hearts can change the world. As the sun set on another day in the neighborhood, children played in the garden while their parents chatted on benches nearby. The flowers that had once guided people to safety now marked a different kind of sanctuary, one where difference was celebrated, history was honored, and community grew stronger with each passing season. And behind her curtains, which now stayed open day and night, Patricia Wilson finally understood what Eleanor had known all along, that the truest measure of a neighborhood isn't found in property values or pristine lawns, but in the courage to welcome change, the wisdom to learn from